welcome Layla Saad. Her book, Me and White Supremacy, grew out of an online effort to get people to confront and disassemble the ways they benefit from whiteness and become what she calls good ancestors, people who leave a legacy of liberation for others to follow. She's a writer, a speaker, and podcast author. She earned her Bachelor of Law degree from Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. She lives in Doha, Qatar, and her husband, Sam, and two children, Maya and Mohammed. So, we are very excited to be able to talk with her tonight, and we also are very excited to announce that this very new book has already released as number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list, and number 88 on USA Today. So, with that, Layla, welcome.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
Wait, are you on? I did not hear you. Oh, there it comes. There it goes.
Can you hear me?
Try again.
Keep going.
Can you hear me?
No. Will you grab the third mic? Sorry about that.
That's
We had
okay.
a sudden technical. That has never happened before.
It's because the TV is here.
So you can hear me, right? So I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to hand this mic over to Layla so she can hear you. I'm going to start with this. This is a really fascinating workbook and book, and a really great exploration of a topic that we are all interested to talk about more tonight. But in this book, you're asking white people, and particularly white people in the United States, like me, to confront the racism. You say outright that you know this can be an uncomfortable process. Can you talk about what motivated you specifically to tackle this as a writer?
Yes. So it's so interesting because I've been asked this question so many times now on this tour. And I think if I had known before embarking on this journey of doing this kind of work, if I had known what this journey was going to be ahead of time, I might not necessarily have chosen it. The work that I was doing before, I was a life coach and a business coach. I wasn't doing anything controversial or, anything that would make people uncomfortable. If anything, I was like, come, I will take care of you and help you grow your business. But in 2017, when the Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville, it was a turning moment for me because I remember seeing the images of the men marching in the streets, which we can all remember, the torches, the racial slurs, everything. And it was like a light just clicked over for me. And I had things that had been brewing up inside of me for many months about things I was observing in the life coaching space, the spirituality, wellness, personal growth space, that I could see was white supremacy, was that people who looked like me were the minority. People who looked like the majority of people in this room were the majority. And I wanted to know why. Why was that the case? Was it because people like me didn't do this kind of work? Or were we being excluded from being seen as the experts, the leaders, the credible people? And so I wrote a letter, an open letter called I Need to Talk to Spiritual White Women About White Supremacy. And I was addressing things that were brought up within me and asking people in that space to look at, you say you want to change the world, heal the world. You say you're all about love and light. You say you don't see color, but racism is running rampant in this space and we need to have a conversation about it. And so I got started on that journey through this letter that went very viral, very, very viral. And so fast forward a year later, one night I'm just thinking about what have they learned in that time since we started having this public conversation. And I grabbed my phone and started writing, what have you learned about you and white supremacy? And I thought, well, what is white supremacy? And what had I observed of it? What had I experienced of it? And started listing out dozens of these things: white silence, tone policing, cultural appropriation, white fragility, dozens of these prompts that I quickly realized wasn't a single post that I was going to share to my community, but rather was a journey. And so I created this 28-day journey, posted it on Instagram that night, said we begin tomorrow, a 28-day journey to explore your complicity in white supremacy. Sounds fun, right? sounds fun, right? And I really thought not many people are going to want to go on this journey because it doesn't sound fun. It sounds uncomfortable and hard. And I woke up the next day and there were so many people who said, I'm scared, but I'm in. And we started that challenge and I had 19,000 Instagram followers. And by the end of the 28 days, that number had more than doubled. We had people coming in every single day to do this work. And so it's been an incredible journey because it came from a place of the anger and grief from Charlottesville and what I was seeing, and then the curiosity of what have they learned. Yeah.
That's amazing. So you started this on social media, as you described.
Which is, I feel like, a very millennial way of writing a book.
So what made you then want to try and convert that social media experience into a book?
Is there anybody in this room who did the original Instagram challenge? No, okay. It was an incredible experience because it was for the first time people having very public conversations around their own unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs. And I'd never seen it done before in that way. It wasn't behind a paywall or in a private setting. Anybody could come on my page and read what was being said. And I knew from day one that this was a very special thing that was happening, and I had to pay attention, and I knew by the end it had to become a book. Because there were people who were watching the challenge who were too scared to join in, and I knew they wanted to do the work, but they were afraid.
Right.
And that because of the transformations that I had seen, I knew it had to go beyond a challenge which I knew I would never run again. It's hard, never doing that again. But it was so incredible that it had to go beyond that live experience. And so I decided to turn it into a workbook. And the great thing about doing that was I was no longer constrained to the Instagram caption size. I could write at length. And I had learned some things. I didn't realize how hard it would be for me and for the people I was asking to go on this journey. And so what I did with the book was, let me just prepare you for what you're about to experience, and let me equip you for a journey that's going to be very uncomfortable. And so we included extra things in the PDF workbook.
Yeah, and having gone through it, in those intro pages do help get you to the notion that this is not light work.
Right.
This isn't something that you can do without a real heavy amount of effort, because it's going to ask you some really hard questions.
Yeah.
Now, the exercises that come in the workbook, obviously, when you did them online, you did them in a particular order.
Yeah.
You had to think about, here's day one, here's day two, and you're asking different and more challenging questions pretty much each day.
Right. It's like
it gets a little
up.
bit harder. Somebody starts and says, I'm good, I'm good. And then, they start seeing themselves, they start seeing their complicity, they start seeing these issues. How did you decide when you were doing it the first time, what was the right order, and did that change when you put it into a print book? Or did it modify? What were those decision points?
So the night that I received the download of what the challenge would be, I actually received dozens. I wrote dozens of these things down. And then when we started day one, which was just the next day, when I woke up and thought, oh no, I said I'm going to do this thing and now I actually have to do it, And from day one, when I was like, let me just choose the easiest one, which is white privilege, because I know some people have heard of this term, so it's a good starting point. As I began to see the way people were engaged just on that day one post, I was like, oh no, you have to make it make sense. The thing that comes next has to build on what just happened.
Right.
Because, at first, it was, like I said, it was the night before and then the next day. And so my plan had been to just share them in the order that I had received them in. But it didn't make sense to do that if it was going to be a sequential journey. Right. And so I was very intentional each day about what was going to come next. And that same order and those same prompts have remained the same from the challenge to the PDF workbook to the hardcover book.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the same.
Yeah. But you were definitely composing that order as it was happening in the challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And the responses that you were getting were.
Yeah, and one of the main things that was important to me was not to do, so week 2, the day 8 to, what would it be, 15? That's a hard week. That's the week we look at racist stereotypes, anti-blackness, cultural appropriation, the things that most people, most well-meaning people who do not want to be associated with racism don't want to admit to. So if I had started that in week 1, most people would have shut down. Because consciously, the way that many people see themselves is, I'm not racist. Because I know who racists are, and they're the bad people. They're the ones who marched in Charlottesville. I'm not one of those people.
Right.
So I can't even hear this. And so in week 1, we start with what I call the basics. And what those do is allow you to understand that white supremacy is not a fringe thing that only some people do. It's actually this whole system and this whole belief and this consciousness that all of us have been conditioned by in different ways. And so when you get to week 2, you're more open to the idea that maybe I do have anti-black thoughts, maybe, since I had all these other things that seem to resonate with things that I know I've done and said and thought.
Okay. And then on that same line, you were talking about how the people were speaking, and that was helping you guide which challenge you were putting to them next, and how you
Yes.
started to order things.
Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned in the book is obviously the difference between the book and the challenge was
Yeah.
that it wasn't just your voice out there.
Yeah.
As you were posting these things, people were responding online, and then some people who might have been working through the issues as a white person trying to adjust or confront or deal with this, there were other people chiming in. Women of
Yes.
color, other voices that were adding to the conversation. How did that influence you then when you went to create the workbook?
Yeah. So the biggest surprise to me was that out of nowhere, Black women I knew and didn't know showed up to help facilitate the work voluntarily. And they didn't have to do that. And my instinct was to try and protect them. Don't look at this. You don't want to read this. It's not nice. Don't look. But they showed up and they helped me facilitate the work. And they collectively have been so integral to me. I have 2 of my closest friends here who are sitting up front who are Black women. And they, you know, it's that sisterhood and that working together that is so integral. When I went from the challenge to the workbook, now I was alone. And it was just me. But the support that they gave in the challenge helped me to push more as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so-
Because there were some voices in there that were like, no, cut the BS. Like, let's, you know, go deeper. And it helped a lot.
That's great. So this is, to some extent, you know, a book that has definitely your writing, but a communal support behind it that
Yes.
had an influence on it.
Yes.
So a
And-
very different type of.
And I think that's so important because nobody does anything alone. Nobody does anything alone. We're sitting in the American Writers Museum and we get to see the legacy, the body of work of so many incredible writers, some of whom, you know, are just everything to me. And I stand on their shoulders because the work that they did has so informed the work that I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. A big part of the book is this notion of journaling. You're asking people to write. You're asking them to engage with these questions and write their responses. It was a writer's museum, so my question becomes, why is it more important for them to write their responses than to just have a conversation with someone around these questions or think about it? Why do you want journaling to happen?
So I have 2 answers to that question. The first one is that when I first started having conversations about race, when I wrote that open letter, it was like a street battle every day on social media, trying to convince white women, no, this is real. You do this. And it was exhausting. It was really exhausting. And what I found when I, instead of telling, asked, it flipped things. It made it easier on me and it made them more open to having the conversation.
Right.
And so that's one part of it. But the other part is when we just, if we're just thinking about it, if you just read the book and think about it, you keep things at a very intellectual level where you're processing it here, but you're not processing it inside. And so when we're talking about racism, racism is not an intellectual study. It's people's lived lives. Yeah. It's their lived experiences. And so that has to be matched with a lived, embodied experience of trying to understand your own unconscious thoughts and beliefs. Because they don't theoretically harm people of color, they actually harm people of color. And so it is important to use your whole body, to put pen to paper, to write out and bring to the surface things that when you just consciously think about them are not there immediately.
Yeah, and I agree fully in the power of writing to make things happen and change. In the introduction to the book, you talk about the need to be a good ancestor. Can you tell us what that means? What does the phrase mean to you?
Yeah, so good ancestor, I think, saved my life and helped me to be able to sit here and have this conversation with you now in a way that I'm able to have it. When I talked about when I first started doing this work and how hard it was, I went from being somebody who, like I said, I was a life coach, right? I was very optimistic, very hopeful, very positive. And when I wrote that letter and began to experience the very nice women who were in my community suddenly have this reaction of what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility, which is that many white people are not used to having nuanced and complex conversations around race. And so when the conversation is brought up, they have a very, sometimes violent reaction to it. You know, it's defensiveness. It's getting angry. It's getting up and walking away. It's saying things they would have never said. They couldn't even imagine that thing would come out of their mouth, or crying. And so I went from being that hopeful, positive person to very negative, very pessimistic, very hopeless, because I couldn't see if something that, if this work has been done for the amount of time that we know it's been done, which is fighting for the liberation and the inequality for people of color. It's been going on for so long, and I could read things that had been written by writers like Audre Lorde. And read it and think, she could have written this today. It's the exact same experience I've had today. And I needed something bigger than what I was seeing to allow me to continue on the journey. Because I couldn't do it from a place of resentment and hopelessness. And so this idea of being a good ancestor went beyond me. It became about my children and my descendants. It became about the people who will come after I'm gone. And so I use that. I have it on the cover. I host a podcast called Good Ancestor Podcast because I needed it. But what's been really interesting is so many people have resonated with it for themselves. And I think for people who have white privilege in particular, what it inspires or what it activates within is this idea that I didn't create white supremacy, but I absolutely benefit from it. And the white people who came before us didn't fix it, didn't dismantle it, didn't change it. Perhaps I can do what I can do right now in this lifetime to create a different future for those who will come after I'm gone. And so it's been this thing that, as I said, selfishly, it was for me, but it has helped so many people.
That's great. And can you tell me or us, some of the people you feel left the kind of legacy you want to leave, who you would consider good ancestors?
Yeah, it's so easy for me to answer. I will say, actually, before I say the people that we all know, I would actually, the first people are my parents, and they're living ancestors today. And, when I got the news of, New York Times, just as we were arriving here, I called my husband first, and then I called my mom, and they're in Qatar, and it's 2 a.m., But I woke them up and told them, because everything they poured into me make me who I am today. Everything, the spirituality, the ability to write and speak, everything I get from them. So they're first. But after mom and dad are writers. You know, we were sat over there waiting, and there's an image of Octavia Butler on the wall, and I bookend the book. I open it and close it with her words. She's a huge influence for me. Audre Lorde as well, who I mentioned as well. Black feminist women who did this liberation work in different ways. You know, Octavia Butler was not an essayist. She was a science fiction writer. Yeah. But I spent, I think it was 2018, 2019, reading through her entire collection. And if you've read The Parable of the Talents and The Parable of the Sower, the character in that book is what inspired me to want to be a good ancestor. Okay. And she documents everything, this character, and it reminds me how important words are. The power of words, because they live beyond us. They live beyond us.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned, you know, there's a month's worth of content in this book. Yeah. And really it's more than a month's worth of content, because you discuss the idea of people being able to walk through it in that 28-day cycle, but they can easily go back to it. Yeah. But you really want them to step through it in the order in which it's kind of put the first time. Yeah. So we can't go over all of these concepts tonight, and we want you all to buy the book and to do it yourselves and to do the work. As you mentioned, it's really important for people to do the work if they want to engage with this content. So I just wanted to ask you about three that I think, you know, as I read through it, you know, hit me. And so I want you to...
Did you see yourself in them?
Yes, yes. And so I want to know, you know, how you define them, and, you know, how do you want someone like myself to respond to these concepts? Yeah. So the first one is white silence.
Okay, so the first, just to sort of zoom out a little bit, that the aim of this book is for people to understand that white supremacy conditions and has infiltrated all of us. And what racism isn't just what we can all point to and say, that person's being racist, but is these unconscious thoughts and beliefs and behaviors which you take as normal, or it's not that bad, and understand that, no, those things actually perpetuate white supremacy, and or they maintain it in place by their non-action. And so white silence is one of those things. Being silent when you see something racist happening, and again, I'm not just talking about seeing somebody call someone a racial slur, but seeing somebody being mistreated, being, you know, racially aggressed in normal situations, and just thinking, is it worth it to say anything? Is it my place to say anything? Does anyone even notice if I say anything? And then just choosing to stay silent, that actively keeps it in place. It's not neutral. It's not a neutral behavior to be silent in the face of racism. And so, you know, I was saying earlier, you didn't create it. You didn't create white supremacy. Nobody here alive created it, but you maintain it. And white silence is one of the ways that you maintain it.
Yeah, and as I mentioned to you, it's, you know, that thing of even just the scroll through Facebook, and you see something from someone you knew in high school, or you see something from a family member, and you ask the question, am I going to confront this here and now on social media? Am I going to...
And there's different ways that you can talk yourself into silence, talk yourself into not saying anything, and making a case for why is it worth it? Right. And moving on. Did anybody actually get harmed? And moving on. Was it that bad? Were they just having a bad day? Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Right. There's different ways you talk yourself into white silence. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I thought that was one. You also talked about the concept of white centering.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, white supremacy, and let's define what it means. White supremacy comes from the root seed belief that people who are white are superior to people of other races, and therefore deserve to dominate over those people. And that has looked, you know, if we just look back on history, we've seen that looks like colonization, genocide, land theft, enslavement, different ways that this has shown up in very violent ways. And people can say, well, that happened before, but it doesn't happen anymore. Right. White centering is very subtle. When I talked at the beginning about why was it that in the space that I was in, life coaching, that industry, There were so few people who looked like me. White centering played a huge part in that. And this was this idea that if a, I'm remembering a conversation I had once. I've been podcasting for a while, and I make an intentional effort to mainly interview people of color, especially Black women. And a question that I got once from a white woman was, is this podcast for me to listen to? Because it was mainly people of color being interviewed. And I said, that's so interesting. Does that mean I have to ask, when I see the majority of podcasts which have majority white guests, do I have to ask, is this podcast for me? White centering is this idea that if something is presented by white people through white people, it applies universally. Yeah. But if it's through people of color, it's only for those people, right? And another example I was giving recently in a book event was, when you watch movies, I watch sort of through two lenses. I'm watching the story, but I'm also watching what's going on racially. And I'm not just looking for, do they have a certain number of people of color, a body count, but how close are those people of color to the role of the protagonist? And I said, something I've noticed that's really interesting is, if in a story, and it doesn't matter if it's a romantic story or not, but there's a romance line, if in a story, one of the romantic partners is a person of color, the other person will not be a person of color unless it's seen as a Black movie. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Unless it's seen as a Black movie and then the audience is Black people, right? But if what happens most of the time is that both romantic partners are white, and that's supposed to be a universal story of love that we can all relate to.
Right.
Right. She said it, yeah. Yeah. Right, so that's what white centering can look like in very subtle ways that doesn't allow people of color to be the center of the story. They're always a side character. Our stories are always marginalized.
Right, and then the other one that I thought was rather powerful was your conversation about white saviorism.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that is I was on a plane recently, and the man sitting next to me, we were cheering because nobody had come to sit in the middle. Yeah. So we're like, yes!
Best thing ever. 3
seats, 2 people. Okay, awesome. And so I was like, so what do you do? And he's like, well, he said, we were flying to here. And he said, well, this is my short flight. I'm actually going on a longer flight to Africa after this. And I was like, in my mind, I'm like, Africa is a continent, not a country. Where in Africa are you going to? And he said, Kenya. And I was like, oh, cool. My dad is Kenyan. Where are you going in Kenya? And he's like, Nairobi. And I said, well, what are you going to do there? And he said, well, I'm the COO of this food program, nonprofit, and we provide meals. And we do it in the US, and we have 5 programs here, but we have one in Nairobi. And so I'm like, my spidey senses are out because I want to know what's going on. And I'm asking and investigating and asking all of these questions. And it was the basis of the company. It was also very much faith-based. So it was sort of like a Christian program, which is fine. I mean, there's Christians in Kenya, but I was like, I'm not going to go deeper into this conversation because I don't want to, we just met. And what was funny after that, he asked me, what do you do? And I was like, well, let me show you my book. This is what I do. And he took a picture of it and everything. But it's this idea, this story is this idea that white people can save Black and brown people from our inherent state of wretchedness, I guess, and lower worth, and that can look like missionary, projects to Black and brown countries, but it can also look like trying to speak for a Black woman when she can speak for herself. Right. It can be very, very subtle, and so. If we root it back to where this comes from, it's that same belief that white people are superior to people of other colors. And so what white saviorism does is it's this belief that I know better for them what's best for them. Right. Because I'm white, and colonization and the whole idea behind that was to go and save Black and brown people. I was at there's a museum in Arizona called the Heard Museum, and it's for the advancement of American Indian arts. And there was an exhibition upstairs about the boarding schools that Native children were forcibly put in and stripped of their entire identity and put in these schools. And throughout the exhibition were words that were used at the time of this policy.
Right.
And it was, take the Indian out of the man. Make him into a man by taking away his culture.
Right.
Because we know what's better for them than they do.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, those are all, as you go through the book and as you go through these different things, each of these has a different hit and a different amount of weight for individuals. Now, I picked 3.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you think people need to know about, another part that I didn't touch on?
I think a big one that many people who start the work, a big one that often feels like a slap in the face when they get to it, is white exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And I think that's around day 6. And what, and what white exceptionalism is this idea that I've read all the books, done all the programs, watched all the documentaries, reposted all the articles and posts on social media.
Right.
I'm one of the good ones.
Yeah.
I already know this. So I don't really need to go that deeply, because let's be real, if I wasn't one of the good ones, I wouldn't have picked up this book in the first place.
Right.
And so it's this conversation, this sort of self-congratulatory conversation of, I don't need to go that deep. And white exceptionalism that day comes up, and it's a call out. It's a call out that it's you too.
Yeah.
It is you too. And be careful of getting into a space of thinking you're one of the good ones, because that leads to a sense of, what it leads to is you become more harmful to people of color. When somebody is outright with their racism, I just know to stay away from them.
Right.
I just know to stay away from them. But if somebody is like, I'm one of the good ones, you can be safe with me, and they haven't examined what's actually going on underneath the surface, and they cause harm in a way they didn't even realize caused harm, that's actually more painful to experience.
Right.
It's more painful because you weren't expecting it, because they created the sense that they're safe to be around. And then you went and told them something that you experienced that was racist, and they say something back to you like, you know what, though, I've experienced that as well. And so maybe it isn't racism, maybe it's something else.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize they didn't see you, they don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're not listening. So I'm just going to mention, I have a couple more questions I'm going to ask. If you have a question you want to write down and just pass it over to the side, after I ask a couple more, we'll jump into those questions. So now, your heritage, personally, East African, Arab, British, Black, Muslim, and you live in the Middle East now.
Yeah.
So what kind of perspective do these identities and experience bring to your writing?
Yeah, it's so interesting. This process of doing this work externally has helped me so much in owning all of who I am. I grew up in Wales. I was born in Wales, and I had a Welsh accent in the beginning of my life. Thankfully, it's gone now. But I grew up as a Black Muslim girl in a predominantly white space, going to predominantly Roman Catholic schools. So I was always aware from the very beginning. My mom has a recording of me when I was about 3 years old, and so I was listening to it recently, and I'm in the background singing, "Welcome, baby Jesus, welcome." And I said to my mom, "What was this?" And she said, "You used to sing it all the time. It was this nursery rhyme. It was this nursery rhyme that you had in nursery, and you used to sing it all the time." And so I've always been aware of my difference, because I would go to school and we would pray how we pray at school, Our Father who art in heaven, right? And then I would come home and we pray in an entirely different way.
Right.
And so it was hard because I had no other person to share that experience with. And the story that I made up in my mind about all of that was, I don't fit in, and who I am isn't acceptable. And who I am is something I should be ashamed of,
Right.
because it isn't the mainstream. And so doing this work, helping others to do this work, has meant I have to do my work and owning all of who I am and learning to love all of who I am. And so what I think I bring to this conversation is I'm able to toggle between two big perspectives, a Western consciousness and a non-Western consciousness. I can zoom in. I grew up, I understand how you think, and I can zoom out and say, but that isn't the whole picture.
Right.
And so I think why that's important is, although we're here in the United States at the American Writers Museum having this conversation, it's important to remember that white supremacy isn't just an American thing. It is a global phenomenon. White supremacy has touched so much of the world through different ways. It shows up differently in different countries and different spaces and places, but it's all white supremacy. Yeah. And I think having those different perspectives of growing up, being born and growing up in the UK, I lived in Tanzania for a portion of my life, and that's where my mom is from, my father's from Kenya. Those are countries that were touched by the colonization of Great Britain. It's the reason they moved to the UK was because they spoke English, because they were colonized by the British, right? And living in the Middle East and seeing, no, even when white people come here, they're treated as superior to people of other races. And so what I'm trying to do with this work is not take a political stance, not take a country-specific stance, but actually help people to understand this is a thing that many of us are conditioned into, and it's about changing from the inside out, raising that consciousness and changing from the inside out.
Okay. And then the last question I'll ask you is, who are some writers who were important to you in the process of forming your thoughts on this and in putting this together? Who are writers who've influenced you?
Yeah, so with the same as, right, it'll be the same as the ancestors, right? So Octavia Butler, Audre Lorde. I was at the Chicago Public Library yesterday, and when I was in the green room there were images of other writers who've influenced me. Alice Walker, Bell Hooks.
Yeah.
I also want to shout out my friend Lisa Renee Hall here, because she does anti-racism and unconscious bias work, and she also uses a process of reflective journaling to help people get into the core. And so there are amazing, brilliant people who have passed, transitioned, and people who exist today as living ancestors who are just doing incredible work, and all of it imprints on you.
Yeah. And so, as I'm waiting for people to pass up the questions, I'm just going to ask one more along that vein. You mentioned Bell Hooks, you mentioned Octavia Butler, and the differences there obviously are the essayist and the scholar versus, say, the science fiction writer.
Right.
Which do you think has more impact on making people think?
I mean, I can't talk for people, but I can talk for me.
Yeah.
And for me, I need all of it.
Yeah.
I need the Toni Morrison and the Octavia Butler, and I need the Audre Lorde and the Bell Hooks. I need it all. I need the poets, the Lucille Cliftons and the Nikki Giovannis. I need them all, because I'm a human being who processes things in many different kinds of ways, and I need knowledge, but I also need heart. And fiction and nonfiction and poetry impacts us in different ways, where it builds up this, it builds this very nuanced and very textured way of understanding what white supremacy is, which is it's not just, no pun intended, black and white. It's not just racist or not racist. Yeah. It's how does racism and white supremacy impact us in different ways, from the feeling to the thinking to the feeling, everything, you know? So I need all of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that came from the audience. I'm going to grab a few more here. It's surprising, this one made me laugh because I'm one of the few.
Good question.
It's surprising, or is it surprising, that there are very few men in this room? Being one of the few men in the room.
You know what's interesting, in the sort of personal growth, personal development space, it tends to be majority women too. And I think women tend to lean towards introspection and self-reflection in a different way than men do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think everybody's agreeing with you.
And that is not, That is not meant as an insult, but it's reflected in what we see in those spaces.
And there's a secondary question here, which is, do you see more resistance to acknowledging complicity in white supremacy from men versus women, from white men versus white women?
I think, I often say within white supremacy, the world is made for a very specific type of person. And that person is white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual.
Yeah.
That's who it's supposed to ultimately benefit. And the more you deviate from that box, the more oppression, discrimination, marginalization you experience. And I think when you benefit so much from something, why do the work where you would have to lose those benefits? Yeah. And I think that's where the resistance comes from. I don't think it's a malevolent hanging on to, but I think nobody likes being uncomfortable. Nobody likes losing something that they like having. And so that's where the resistance, I think, comes from.
Okay. So this is a question from someone in the room who is a white teacher, teaching in a school, I think they're saying primarily Latinx and African American students. Is there a way to avoid the pitfalls of white saviorism?
Yeah, I think the very first place to start is to do work like this, regardless of whether it's my book, my work, or somebody else's, but really examining what am I bringing into that space? What am I bringing into that space that I'm not even aware of? How am I viewing these children in ways that is harmful to them, that I'm not aware of? Consciously, we all like to believe we're good people.
Right.
And we keep that definition of good real simple, right? And we don't want to look at the other parts of ourselves. That is a human tendency. Mm-hmm. When you go into spaces like that and you're coming in with white privilege and unexamined unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs, you don't even know the ways you could be doing harm. I was I can't remember what city it was now. It's been a long trip and I've been in many cities, but I was in a certain city and the security person who was with me was a black man. And so when we finished the talk, we were driving back to the hotel and I said, "Did you enjoy the talk?" And he said, "I did." And he said, "When you were talking, I remembered so many things that happened. And I remember being in school and constantly being told, you're disadvantaged, you're disadvantaged, you're disadvantaged." And I just couldn't take it anymore. And so I dropped out of school.
Yeah.
I dropped out of school. And so I don't know what the intention of those people who kept telling him that was, but the impact was that it caused his life to go in an entirely different direction than he might have consciously wanted.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's important to examine what are you bringing into that space.
Yeah. And even more. With increased white supremacist ideologues present in classrooms or ideologies present in classrooms by people who use language in anti-racist work, how do we change our strategies for confronting this?
I don't understand the question.
I'm going to try that again. With increased white supremacist ideologies present in classrooms.
What does that mean?
I am not sure. But let's go on. I'm sorry if I misunderstood your question, and my eyesight isn't what it should be. What, if anything, did you learn or were most surprised to discover about white supremacy during the initial Instagram challenge?
I would say how sneaky it can be. How sneaky it can be, and what it can really look like in practice that people, just by being prompted to examine, were able to uncover within themselves. One particular day stands out to me. It was the day we did on what have you learned about you and black women, which was for me the hardest day for obvious reasons, and was the one day of the challenge where I did cry because it was that hard. But I remember one of the things that was written was a white woman said, I went to the doctors and was surprised when the doctor came out and they were a black woman. Because they just weren't expecting it. Because in their mind, black women don't hold are not that smart, I guess, you know, are not able to occupy that kind of a space. And it was only because we've been doing the work for a number of days now that she was able to recall that memory, because she said that that was my first thought, and then I immediately knew that was wrong,
Right.
and replaced it with a second thought, which was, it's completely, I don't see color, right? And so what was interesting in observing what people were writing was how sneaky it is, that there is always a first thought, and that you recognize that's not right, can't do that, can't be one of the racists. Let me replace it with a second thought that matches up with the person I think I am,
Right.
with the thoughts I think I have. And so that sneakiness was, yeah.
And then the second question is, how have you scaled the program to meet the intersection of race and misogyny?
Yes, so Black women. So Black women is the day that we look at that, and misogynoir, which is that intersection of experiencing sexism and experiencing anti-Blackness at the same time. Women of color, especially Black women who are not cisgendered and heterosexual, always face the most oppression. And I encourage people in the work when they're looking at these days, don't just, when you're thinking about a woman, don't just think of a woman who's straight and cisgendered. Think about these other intersections as well, and how does that modify how you treat them?
Okay. And this question, which I actually know the answer to from going through the book, but I'm going to ask you.
You're going to answer it.
No, I'm going to let you answer it. But is the book meant to be a solitary journey? If so, how can a group use it to add more depth through conversation, et cetera?
Yeah.
So you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah. So when I initially did the Instagram challenge, it was just a solitary journey, very much about individual self-reflection. And when we finished the challenge, and I announced I was going to write a book, I kept getting requests and requests about, I want to do this work with my family. I want to take this into work. I want to do this in a group. Can you include instruction on how to do that? And so I did just that. In both the workbook and the hardcover book, there is an appendix in it that it tells you how to do a Me and White Supremacy book circle using a process called the Circle Way. And the Circle Way is a book that was written by Christina Baldwin and Anne Linnea, and they gave me permission to include an excerpt from their work in the book. And what the Circle Way does is, their tagline is, a leader in every chair. One of the most important things for me in choosing a process for how to do this in a group was not to recreate white supremacist paradigms, hierarchies, and that can happen when there is a leader who is more woke, who knows more, and can tell the other white people what to do. I didn't want to do that. I wanted people to understand this is lifelong work. You will be uncovering more and more as you go on this journey, and so have a circle process where everyone is responsible for doing the work. Nobody is more ahead than another, and everybody is responsible for making sure that we're all on the journey. And so I include an extensive appendix for how to do this in a group.
Yeah.
And I want to say, sorry, there is a lot of value in doing it in a group as well. Doing it individually is also great, and some people just process things better by themselves. But the value of doing it in a group is you stay accountable to the process. You don't clock out at day 3 and realize what this journey actually is and think this is too hard. And you get to see that you're not the only one who has these unconscious thoughts and beliefs. Other people do too, people you respect, people you like. And so it doesn't stay as this personal thing that you feel shame about, where you feel like it's only me and I'm such a bad person for believing this. You start seeing that people in your life also feel that way. And so it goes from a personal thing to a collective thing.
So another question here, which I know you address in the book, but it's something that is, how the work may change with a non-white audience who have white privilege. Example, white Latinx, white passing Arabs, all kinds of. You talk about that.
Yes. So early on in the book, before you even get to the 28 days, I define who this work is for, and I don't say it's for white people. I say it's for people who have white privilege, which is very wordy, and it's easier if I could have written throughout the book white people, but I keep saying people with white privilege, because you can be a person of color or biracial or multiracial who passes as white or is seen as white or can be mistaken for white if they don't know more about you. But I include a kind of asterisk to that if you fit in there, because the process for those people is very different to those who are just white. It's complicated. I did an event in Washington, D.C. I remembered Washington, D.C. And I talked about this, and after the talk, a Palestinian woman came to talk to me afterwards, and she said, "I'm really glad you said that, because myself and my family have been pretty much doing that, passing as white, and where we can get away with it, we will do it, because that's easier than having to deal with being seen as Palestinian. But what it has meant is that we've had to sacrifice parts of ourselves. We've had to subdue parts of our culture and our heritage in order to fit into this box of whiteness. And so for people who fit into that, who have white privilege but are not white, it's complex and it's nuanced, because you have to look at, how have I had unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs and harmed other people of color? And how have I been on the receiving end of racism and not addressed it, allowed it to happen in order to continue to receive white privilege?
Right.
Yeah.
And we had an author here just yesterday. I think I mentioned a Cuban-American author named Pablo Cartaya, who's a young adult author, and he told a story of his being a young man and acting, which he did early on in his career before he became a writer, and being told by a casting agent, you should change your name.
Right.
You should pass as white.
Right.
Because he could.
Right.
And just how painful that was.
Yeah.
And so it is something that is definitely out there and a choice that people sometimes make, as you said.
And feel that they have to make.
Yeah, because it will be easier for them if they're told it will be
Right.
easier, and that they should sacrifice who they are. So another question is your thoughts on navigating the line, if there is one, between white saviorism and using privilege for good or dismantling privilege.
I always get asked this question. How do I know if I'm using my privilege versus am I being a white savior? Okay. Sorry to break it to you. There is no checklist. There is no perfect way to do anything, especially in this work. And sometimes you will get it wrong. You will absolutely get it wrong. What's important is to keep developing this skill which this work teaches you, which is critical self-examination. The more aware you are of your unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs, the less harm you will do. The more aware, the less harm you will do. And so if you are someone who's going through this work and you get to the day on white saviorism and you start to realize, actually I have a long history and pattern of trying to save people of color,
right.
It's probably a tendency for me. And so I should probably question when I do that. And then the other part is, instead of swooping in to save the day, ask questions. Ask questions. Ask if you're needed. If you're needed, how? Ask the people of color to whom you're trying to, be in allyship with or to. Ask them what they need. We know what we need. Like I said earlier, I don't need somebody to speak for me. I know how to speak.
Right.
But I might need you to, when I'm being racially aggressed, I might say, can you talk to them? Because I'm done. If I ask you, you're not saving me because I asked you. But if you assume and you just step in, then yeah, maybe you're saving me because maybe I was fine.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a good one. How would this conversation be different if you were being interviewed by a black woman?
Yeah. This one, what's really funny? I was speaking to somebody yesterday and I said, this is going to be my first interview with a white man. in this whole tour, because nearly every interview that I've done on this tour has been with a black woman, bar one, I think, has been with a black woman. Yeah, it absolutely changes things. But no, it doesn't change me. It doesn't change me. It might change the dynamic, but it doesn't change me.
Yeah.
Because part of my personal anti-racism work has been to learn how to not bend and fold myself for the white gaze. And so I stay true in myself as a black woman, and I trust that you can handle it.
I'm doing my best. And, I was just handed this one, and then I have one more I'm going to ask you.
Great questions, by the way.
Yeah, these are really good. As a recovering, well-meaning white woman, in quotes, who has recognized past harms, what are your thoughts on reaching out, sending a letter to make amends to black people who you may have harmed? My gut says no, but I believe in the power of taking responsibility or accountability.
Unless you're my best friend who harmed me, and I write in the book of a best friend who was white and did do this, and I chose to end the friendship because she just couldn't show up for me. Unless you're that person in my life, I don't need a letter from you. We had a personal relationship. Yeah, I would appreciate if you reach out to me. But if you realize one day, and I'm laughing because I get DMs all the time about, oh my God, your work has helped me to realize that this thing that I did was racist. Do you think I should go in? And I'm like, no, they don't remember. And they don't care. And you coming back to them now is just going to annoy them, right? Because they had to get over it in the moment when it happened. And really, who are you doing it for?
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
and
that's
I'll
a
leave
good
that
answer.
there.
I'm going to ask you one more,
Okay.
which I thought was a good one to end on.
Okay.
And then what this question asks is basically throughout this very uncomfortable process of engagement, you know, and what you've done with this and what you've worked through on this, what still gives you hope?
My children. It was so cheesy, I know. But my children, because that's who I do this for. I do it for Layla, the little girl who always grew up feeling alone and other, and my children who deserve to live in a world where they are treated with their full humanity and dignity, no matter where in this world they set foot. They're the ones who give me hope, because they're beautiful, they're amazing, they are everything, and they're the ones who give me hope. Yeah.
That's great. So I want to thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to ask you all to thank Layla for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
I hope
Thank you so much.
I hope you all had a wonderful time. Again, as I mentioned, there are books for sale in the back. If you haven't gotten it already, please make sure you get a copy tonight. They're already signed. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
On a recent episode of Book TV's monthly call-in program,